So let's keep on. We're in Eagleton's work here, Ideology, Chapter 3 now. So there'll be a few videos definitely to cover Chapter 3. Well, partially cover it because, again, there's a lot of stuff going on in these chapters that I'm not covering. I'm just sort of giving the highlights and give you a sort of a good entry point into the book, or to help unpack maybe a little bit so you can think a little bit more deeply, hopefully, about the book. But don't neglect going to it and reading it itself. It's very rich and very interesting and controversial too, which makes it fun. Okay, so chapter 3a, from the Enlightenment to the Second International. The Enlightenment, so sort of we kind of heard about that. Some people, are big on the Enlightenment, some people not so much. But the Enlightenment is basically, when philosophers and scientists and stuff, connected to the scientific revolution in a loose way, where reason became paramount, right? This notion that reason was really going to help us. Reason was kind of viewed fairly abstractly, not completely, but quite abstractly. And reason was going to kind of be that tool that we use. And it's kind of like a power as well. So there were different views on this notion of reason in terms of just how abstract it was and how it could be used, because even people that are associated with the Enlightenment didn't always agree on what it was. But there was an emphasis on reason as this kind of great power, and it's going to basically get us out of a lot of messes if we would just be reasonable with each other. And also, reason was seen as something that helps us not only just get out of messes, but some kind of like to transcend the human condition, right? That we can sort of like reason like the angels. Okay, so that's kind of a hand waving thing about it, of the Enlightenment. And from the Enlightenment of that time down to the Second International, so we're looking at a couple hundred years. The Second International, you might be thinking, what's the First International? What are we talking about, this international? Basically, it's sometimes the Second International is called the Socialist International. It's just a term that refers to a bunch of social and labor parties and groups that were united, and from different countries. So hence the term international. There was a First International, there was a second, and these sort of bodies got together and they laid down certain things. They made certain arguments about the way, Socialist International, what you would think, how society should be organized. I think the notion of May Day, like the 1st of May, as we're International Workers' Day, is one of the things of the Second Internationals group. I think International Women's Day comes out of that as well. They did have in the Second International in the late 19th century, because it runs from about 1889 to about 1916, just into the First World War. It was disbanded. They talked about anti-colonialism, and they produced some things against colonialism, but not enough according to other people. So a lot of these things, they a lot of the views that they had were, progressive for their time, and maybe today you might look back and go, well, not all that progressive. But remember, we are talking about around 1890 to 1916. So, what's progressive then might look a little different than today. Okay, so that's the period that Eagleton's looking at, and this is sort of a historical chapter. Now he begins with something kind of interesting, and it sort of kickstarts his historical view, because the main figure he's looking at is Marx, right? Not surprisingly, it's really a chapter on Marx, right? So it's kind of the 19th century guy in reaction to German idealism in this social philosophy of Marx. But the other figure that he looks at is Antoine de Tracy, obviously a very French guy, in about 1754 to 1836, so around that time of the Enlightenment. But let's just back up a little bit. Okay, think of words like psychology, deontology, biology. You notice they all have the same suffix, some kind of ology, right? Okay. Now, and that's, traced originally to the term logos, which has a zillion different meanings. It's an old Greek term, lots and lots of different meanings. Sometimes it means reason, sometimes it means rationality, and sometimes it means word, language, discourse. Tons of meanings, right? No big deal. But it's hard to translate. However, when you take it as a suffix, usually in this sense, like ology, it tends to be something like the study of. So, psychology, psyche is the old Greek term, which was like a soul or a spirit, something like that. Deontology, so there's that ology again. Deon or deontis or deontic or whatever, that was really the issue of obligations. So psychology would be the study of the soul. Deontology would be the study of obligations. And bios, biology, bios, bios, meaning life. So biology, study of life. Okay, so the study of ology. So in other words, exology, if we just take these guys out, and ology really means exology is the study of X. Okay, so you would say, okay, well that's kind of interesting, but there's an inversion sometimes where exology is X itself. So methodology. So when we talk about a methodology, if we say, what's your methodology? We're not asking you for what are your views on the, or the, you're not to study, like this is a course on methodology. Would it really be the study of method, or would it usually be, we're going to learn a method? What is your methodology? Is something along the lines of what is your method, right? So that's an inversion of the term. So methodology is really doesn't follow this word, this kind of phrasing. It follows this kind of phrasing or this logic where methodology is really X itself, method. Okay, so this inversion happened to some words, and it also happened to ideology, because in the original, back in the olden days when de Tracy was writing, and by the way, he's the guy that coins the term ideology, but he didn't mean it in the way if we say, you know, oh, there's an ideology in that group, you wouldn't say that, or there are a bunch of ideologues, you wouldn't say, oh, they're people that study ideology. No, you'd say these are people that practice ideology, right? Ideology, again, has gone through that inversion. But when de Tracy was writing, right, he was a bit of a subversive guy, and Napoleon didn't like him and his gang. Well, he liked him at first, and then he didn't like them. Kind of typical with political leaders. They sometimes like academics and intellectuals, and then we turn out to be kind of a nuisance, and then they don't like us that much anymore. You know, and so, you know, academics have to be careful. So in any case, and de Tracy, he did get in trouble with Napoleon. Well, so did a lot of people. So ideology was originally the study of ideas. It was kind of like a science, right? Now in English, we don't really use sciences quite as liberally as they do in other languages. But like in French, like a science of ideas, the study of ideas. And so now we have the inversion where ideology is kind of like the ideas themselves. Okay, but this, Eagleton says, even in its original time, this ideology, even though it was originally like a science of ideas, he said, you know what? Yeah, that's sort of the original notion of ideology being a science of ideas. But even then, this science of ideas was ideological in the modern sense. It was, come on, it wasn't a pure science of ideas. It was a biased science of ideas, so to speak. And how was that? Okay, so the Eagleton says, okay, this is how he sees it. He says something like this. There's a couple of reasons why at the early days, even when ideology was supposedly this science of ideas, there's a couple of things underneath it all that really is like, no, it's an ideological critique of ideological sort of science of ideas. So an ideological critique of ideas. How so? Well, first, number one is this original notion of ideology as critique, as examination, critique of ideas, was heavily indebted to John Locke. Okay, John Locke, great British empiricist, his empiricism. And what is his empiricism? It basically says that an easy way to think of his empiricism, an old prof, when I took courses on Locke, said, look, the body is out there in the world, running around in the world. The world has an impact. It impacts on the body. It hits and strikes it, right? You know, winds and water and air and all kind of food and all that. And it strikes the body. So the world hits the body, and then the body gets ideas. Right? That's the way to think of it. That's how ideas come about. Now you can get, well, how does that work? Does it create them? Does it generate them? Well, how does that work? Okay, that's another story. But basically, ideas come from experience, right? And a bodily experience. So you're out in the world and you have experiences, and and that contact with the world gives rise to ideas. So going around the world, getting struck and bumped around by the world, that's how the body gets ideas, right? And so that's ultimately in the mind. It's full of ideas. Okay. And so there's no innate, in other words, there's no innate sources of things. Locke is a little wobbly in places, but we don't have to fuss too much about that. But Locke's empiricism, but what Eagleton, he just declares, and he doesn't argue it, but it's interesting because Locke was, he was a businessman, and he had all kinds of, he owned stock and parts and shares in some pretty dubious enterprises by today's standards, for sure. Not so much back then, but certainly we would look at it and go, these are kind of corrupt businesses and whatnot. But in any case, Eagleton, he doesn't go into detail. He just says, Locke's empiricism is shot through with bourgeois ideological assumptions. So I imagine it's something to do with the connection to maybe his business interests or whatever. I'm not sure. But Eagleton doesn't really explain. But anyways, so it's this sort of dream of everything being open, as the Enlightenment says. No, not really. It had ideological, in the modern sense of the term ideological, it had prejudices and all kinds of things in that too. It wasn't this pure reason stuff. They talked like that, but they were human too, and so they didn't always think and follow up on their ideals. All right. So no special intuitions of God or messages from God or whatever. It's just the world. It has an impact on the body. The body gets ideas. However, amongst all these things that are going on in Locke's empiricism are these bourgeois ideological assumptions. And the second one, the view appeal to reason, appeals to science, and it rejects God, rejects superstition. Oh no, we're not doing that anymore. That's medieval. So a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers, really, oh, we're not medieval. That's so awful anymore. And you can see the roots of that in Descartes, where he even brings up some medieval notions and then just rejects them. Why? Because they're medieval. But of course he cheats because and later on in like the Meditations, he brings in medieval notions and they help him out. So people, it's not really that surprising. People are inconsistent, and they say one thing and do another. But the point here is that in this early sort of Enlightenment thing, they appealed to reason and masked the power interests that were behind it all, so that science and reason and all these things served political interests, but they were talked about like, oh no, it's just a pure appeal to science and nothing to political interests. So ideology it was born as a science of ideas. So ideology was born as a critique of ideas, but in fact it was an ideological critique of ideas. So it's kind of an ideological ideology, to put the two senses of ideology together. And sort of Eagleton leaves you, when you read this, with the effect that, well, the so-called Enlightenment thinkers, the bringers of light and reason, just blinded everyone to sort of these purposes and sort of murky things in the background, the bourgeois ideological assumptions and the masking of power. But as the old saw goes, who's going to look at these bringers of light? Who watches the watchers, as they like to say, who educates the educators? And if everything is exposed, however, to the blinding light of reason, shouldn't the blinding light of reason be exposed too? And Eagleton says, well, the Enlightenment figures had no answer to this question, like, that there wasn't really this examination of reason stuff. I don't think he's right on that one. I think there were a lot of critiques. I mean, I think Immanuel Kant wrote a book, a big, large one, that was the critique of reason. And while he doesn't, of course, he's got his biases and things too, there was an awareness that reason itself needed to be grounded and thought about and critiqued as well. So I don't think it's quite as blind as what Eagleton says, or at least the way I read Eagleton. I think he's going a little bit too far. So he says that, you know, these philosophers and thinkers just went into their pursuit of the essence of mind, and they were going to wrest ideas and power and everything from the kings and priests, and give it over to reason. But in other words, what they really did is they invested in the ruling classes that were in the elite of scientific theorists. I think that's contestable, but in any case, interesting enough. So there was nonetheless at this time a number of people that were looking at this. And if you go and you read the history of philosophy, you'll find like people, you know, in a variety of times, you know, like thinking about re-engineering society and running it along the lines of reason. You know, I mean, clearly thinkers like, you know, Rousseau and Hobbes and all that, they were big on this idea that, you know, we can sort of overturn a lot of traditional thought. And we, through reason, we could reorganize society to make it better and run it along the lines of reason. Okay, so Eagleton then turns to an interesting, and as I mentioned, one of the main figures, the other is Marx in this chapter, of Antoine Destutt de Tracy, as I mentioned. So he's in this kind of spate of thinkers that was interested in sort of the reevaluation and rejigging of society along lines of reason. Now, there's an important figure around this time who's not mentioned often in philosophy books, but has a huge impact on everything from economics to philosophy to literature, and that is Isaac Newton. Lots of people began their books. Hume does it, de Tracy does it, lots of people do it. You know, and it's like this Newton, like Newton has discovered the method, right? And even John Locke says, you know, I'm just an under laborer compared to the great Isaac Newton. You know, Isaac Newton sort of laid the system of the foundation of the world, and he built it. And what am I doing? I'm just this under laborer that's kind of sweeping up along, like Newton built the great building of knowledge, and I'm just sweeping up along the outside and cleaning it up and helping it make a little bit pretty. Look a little prettier, and that's what I do. But Newton basically built the place. So there was like Newton was a major figure in his own time and recognized as such. You know, God said, "Let Newton be, and all was light," as the poets say. So Destutt de Tracy says that he is going to be sort of the Isaac Newton of his time. He's following in Newton's footsteps. And that physical science, natural science, rational, mathematical, induction based on observation, reason, that's what we're working with now. And we're going to use reason to construct systems that can make predictions, and then we can test those predictions against experiments. So we're going to, put everything on a firm footing. And Kant talks about, putting science on a firm footing as well. So this idea of a rational firm footing was important at the time. And it goes back even prior to Newton with Descartes. But everybody was more impressed with Newton's system than Descartes' physical system, because Newton's just worked a lot better. So it wasn't just the rational foundations. It was the pragmatic consequences of the system too, because Descartes put his system on probably stronger rational foundations, but Newton's system maybe wasn't quite on the same kinds of foundations, but it worked a lot better than Descartes. So everybody abandoned Cartesian physics. All right. So de Tracy thought he was going to be the Newton of ideas, everything out in the open, governed by reason, and they were going to rebuild France on rational foundations. Now, at first, you think about rebuilding France at this time, well, you got to think about Napoleon. And at first, Napoleon was kind of okay with this, right? He thought this was interesting. And Napoleon seems to be the one to have coined the term ideologue. Right. And I think it was at first not so pejorative, but eventually he used it as a pejorative one. But it's not surprising that a group of intellectuals saying that we are going to rebuild France is not going to sit that well eventually with the guy that dubbed himself, crowned himself the emperor. It's like, if anybody's rebuilding France, says Napoleon, it's going to be me, Napoleon. Napoleon, as emperor, he was going to rebuild it, and probably in this kind of context, it came to characterize these guys as a bunch of sort of ideologues, and that they were sort of out of touch. But anyways, in this context, though, of De Tracy at this time, it shows the emergence of ideology and the study of ideas as connected to social construction, political kind of movements, activism, but doing stuff, right? Not necessarily just a system of ideas. So it shows how it's also connected with people who want to change things, and so ideas become pressed into the service of people who want to change things. So it's not merely an abstract study of ideas, but a study of ideas in order to press them into service. And so it's not surprising also, as scholars and academics tend to do, is even the active side of it will be turned and engulfed by the study, and so eventually even the study of the practical side becomes a theoretical study, and so this eventually led to some of the accusations of this sort of thing became less of a science of ideas and a disconnected domain of ideas, right? And Napoleon's criticisms that they were just ultimately kind of being irrational, and kind of like Hume accused people, like if you're looking too much at reason and rationality to do everything, you can end up being irrational. Like, for instance, asking how far reason can go, and pressing and pressing and pressing. There's a natural place where reason, so to speak, kind of leaves off, and you can't push it any further. And to keep demanding, as Hume, and I think kind of in the spirit of Napoleon, is saying that to keep pressing for reasonable answers to things becomes irrational in and of itself. And so ideology then moves away from being some sort of study, some sort of science of ideas, to just this sort of disconnected domain of ideas. And this notion of ideologies as a disconnected domain of ideas is going to be picked up by Marx and his colleague Engels, and the rest of this chapter will be looking at Marx's views on ideology, from the early Marx in the German ideology, in his work, The German Ideology, to the later Marx, especially in the opening sections of Das Kapital, on how the notion of ideology undergoes some changes even in the thought of Marx, and that will lead into where it is at the end, sort of this messy situation of ideology at the end of the 19th century. Okay, so that's it for this. We'll stop with De Tracy, and in the next video, pick up and think about and read and wonder what Eagleton is talking about when he talks about Marx's view of ideology. See you next video.